Thank you for joining us today at the Sacks-Herenstein Center here at Yeshiva University. We are honored to have Avi Meir, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, with us to help give us a sense of what's happening on the ground. Avi, before I begin, I want to say that our hearts and our tefillot, our prayers, are all with you, your family, the people of Israel. We're waiting to hear good news, so to vote soon. Avi, we had, a shocking reality hit last week. It's been quieter over the weekend. How would you describe the mood in the country right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back, although I wish it were under happier circumstances. I think everyone's kind of walking around in a bit of a daze. I think the initial shock has somewhat worn off. But the just the magnitude of the devastation is something that I think no one has really come to terms with yet. 1,300 people dead is just like an unimaginable number. And I remember during the day itself, that Shabbat a week ago, when the first reports started coming in and the first number was 22, we thought that was like an astronomical number. And then it just kept climbing and climbing and climbing. And now we're at 1,300, and God only knows if we're going to go further. So I think the people are still in a state of trauma. There's a lot of grief, a lot of people whose loved ones are still missing. We don't know whether they're alive in Hamas captivity or dead. I have friends who are volunteering at the Victim Identification Center in Ramla, and there are families that have been camped out there for days and days, just waiting to hear if their loved ones are amongst those bodies being held there. So it's a very difficult atmosphere in that respect. And then, of course, there's the uncertainty about the possibility of a ground campaign, which appears to be in the offing at some point in the next few hours or days. We don't know exactly what the timing will be, but they've amassed about 360,000 reservists in Gaza ahead of that possibility. And then at the same time, there's stuff going on in the north. There have been exchanges of fire between Hezbollah and the IDF all day, including 9 rockets that were fired into Israel, 5 of which were intercepted a short time ago. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's not a great feeling in Israel right now. Although I will say, things seem to be, I wouldn't say they're returning to any sense of normalcy, but more things are opening up. More people are out and about now than were a week ago. Last week, it was basically a ghost town. I walked several times from my office near the entrance of the city to my home in the German colony. It's about a 45-minute walk to the center of town, and you could hear a pin drop. It was like a ghost town. It was very, very weird how few people were out and about. And now things are opening up to some extent, although many employees, many of the members of the workforce are out in Miluim on reserve duty. And so a lot of places aren't able to open, but those that are able to seem to be opening, and some semblance of normalcy is returning to the streets of the city.
Yeah, we spoke last, Avi, on Tisha B'Av. We talked about the protests and the polarization and the divisions in Israel. What we're seeing now is an outpouring of love and compassion and solidarity and chesed. I mean, so many people are doing so many things. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I mean, look, so the most basic manifestation of that, of course, is the number of people who have signed up or reported for duty, for reserve duty, 360,000, including many who have flown in from all over the world. El Al, for the first time in decades, flew on Shabbat to bring people back to Israel. I tweeted a story that got a lot of resonance about a Haredi man at JFK who apparently just started paying for people's plane tickets, and paid for, I think it was like 250 tickets or something. I can't corroborate that. I don't know that it's true, but it sounds like something that could have happened, and certainly something that's in the spirit of what people are experiencing here. The outpouring of volunteerism in this country has been really remarkable, including on the part of organizations that had been at the forefront of the protests against the judicial reform. They've sort of mobilized their own people to report for duty, including many people who said they wouldn't report for duty under this government. They've mobilized to create care packages for elderly people living in the Gaza area, to support the soldiers, to send massive amounts of food. One of the stories that I know my mom liked very much and I thought was lovely as well, was that there are quite a few Tel Aviv restaurants that are some of the best routes in the country, and some of the traffists that have become kosher in order to enable them to send meals down to army bases and feed the troops. So it really is remarkable. It's really beautiful to see. Several visiting dignitaries have come to Israel and they've participated in the efforts. I know Secretary of State Blinken visited a volunteer center. The temporary U.S. ambassador went to donate blood. There's been a lot of that, and it's been very heartening to see.
Yeah, it's heartening to see here. We get videos and reports. Let's talk a little bit about coverage. Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal yesterday said that after decades of covering the Middle East, this situation is not a continuation of past conflicts. There's something new here that she's trying to put her finger on, a new level of brutality and exposure, a moral relativism that's coming out of universities today and making Jewish students feel extremely isolated world over. What are you seeing about the coverage that feels different to you?
Well, this is my first conflict as a journalist. I've only been in this position for about 7 months, and so it's been a real trial by fire, tarte mashma, I guess. And it's been really harrowing, actually, to see it from this side of the story. I think one of the most notable instances of this, and we actually wrote our editorial about it this morning at the Jerusalem Post, was about those reports last week that several dozen babies had been killed, including several that had been beheaded. And the most basic human response to that should be revulsion and horror. And yet what you saw, particularly on social media, but also on the part of some journalists, was like, this questioning of, is that true? And why haven't you shown us any proof? And that's so strange. And can we believe you? And so Israel did something that it very rarely does. Israel has a practice of not showing graphic photos of the results of terror attacks out of kavod hamet, dignity of the dead, and also just a desire not to stoop to the level of those on the other side who revel in showing gore and blood and other horrible things. But because this chorus of voices was so strident, Israel felt that it couldn't ignore them. And so it released 3 photos, including 2 photos of, it's hard to even describe it, blackened baby bodies, basically bodies of babies that had been burnt to death, and another that was riddled with bullet wounds. And you would think that that would be it, and yet that wasn't it. And people started saying, well, who's to say that those are actually from Gaza? And maybe they were actually created by artificial intelligence. Maybe these are all AI generated images. And you're like, what will it take to like get through to these people? And the editorial today that we published said, we should obviously do what we can to get to those people who are reasonable and decent and can be swayed by compelling facts and figures. But there are certain people, like those voices, who will never be convinced because they don't want to be convinced. It doesn't matter how much reality you throw at them. They're dead set against anything that portrays Israel in a sympathetic light, largely, I think, because they're mostly anti-Semitic. I think the Venn diagram of people who deny the murder of Jewish babies by Hamas is probably a circle when compared to those who deny the Holocaust. And so Israel should just give up on trying to get those people because it's never going to convince them. I think the decision was right, actually. I think we should have put out those photos. We had a dilemma internally about whether to display them on our website. We ended up confirming that we saw them, but then linking to a government Twitter page so that people could go there if they so wanted. With, of course, a notation that it was that these were graphic images. But that was just one instance of how difficult this has been over the past week, and how there's some people who are just impervious to fact. They don't want it. They don't want their minds to be changed. They don't want to come to face with fact and figures, and that's just reality we need to contend with.
Yeah, and like you said so wisely, there are people who might be on the fence and they need that kind of convincing, then they're convinced. But there are other people, this is just not their agenda. The New York Times today reported that there's been so much posting, tweeting, that this is really like another online war. And
Mhm.
it's led to a lot of misleading information. We know, and we've had warnings for high school students not to spend as much time in front of the media because it's causing all kinds of stress and deep anguish. What's your take on that, given the unique place you sit on? I mean, how much news is too much news right now? And sometimes we feel like if we're not paying attention to the news, we're sort of betraying our brothers and sisters who, we're there heart and soul. And at the same time, some of this is just, it's so hard to stomach, as you rightly said.
Look, I don't know that there's a formula. I don't know there's a pat answer that I could give for everyone. I am an avid news consumer. It's my job. I did it even before it was my job. And so I don't know that there is too much news for me. What I can say is that there's certain things that I just don't want to see because I know that I can't unsee them. Um, so those images were an example. I actually did ask to see them because I felt that it was my duty to. And I was walking in the street. I had to stop in the middle of the street and clasp my hand over my mouth for several seconds because I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then there was a video that was circulated yesterday. I can't even describe it. These are things that no one should ever have to see. But they're reality. I think that especially at a time when Israel's very legitimacy and the legitimacy of Israel's perspective is called into question, to show what these terrorists, these awful, awful human beings are capable of, I think might actually be necessary. And so, I certainly wouldn't say to everyone that this is something you have to do. If you don't feel that you can stomach it, don't do it. But I think it's important to see that this is actually what has happened, and that's why Israel is responding in the way that it has. And I tweeted earlier that the narrative is already shifting. I was on MSNBC about an hour ago, and the entire intro to my segment was about the situation in Gaza. And I got on and I said, I have to tell you, I feel like I'm in a parallel universe. I said, I feel like the events of just 1 week ago have gone completely unnoticed. And they started challenging me on it. And they said, well, actually, we had segments earlier. I said, yeah, I get it. But this is still a reality that is very, very real to people who live in Israel. There are people whose loved ones may be lying in a refrigerator somewhere in central Israel and they don't even know about it, or who might be in Gaza and we don't know about that either because Hamas obviously won't disclose that in order to just increase the torment for Israeli civilians. So I don't know that there's an answer as to how much news is too much or how much is just enough. I think obviously people should engage in self-care and do whatever they feel is necessary. But I also think that, and this is a hashtag I've seen over the past few weeks or past week or so, don't look away because this is a reality and we can't afford to bury our head in the sand.
Yeah. So there's that some place I looked today. I had 108% rise in my own phone usage. It was like 4 hours because it's very hard to put down. At the same time, it's become very, very hard to concentrate and think and read. I'm wondering if that's something that you're as a person and a professional struggling with right now.
I mean, this has become my life for the past week. I breathe this. The only thing I do basically while I'm awake is deal with this horrible situation. I get very little sleep. I eat very little. And so my entire life is consumed by this. I don't know that that's healthy. It's just the situation that we're in, and it's the profession that I'm in, that produces that. I think a balance is obviously healthy. I don't think it's probably good for me or for anyone to be consumed by this all the time because of how horrible it is. But the reality is that this is what life is like in Israel right now. This is the only thing people can think about because it affects our lives in so many ways. I'm thinking about my own newsroom. I have one reporter who's out on Miluim. I have reserve duty. I have several staff members whose spouses or kids are out on reserve duty. Several who haven't left their homes in several days because they're afraid to be away from a bomb shelter because they live in areas of Tel Aviv or elsewhere that have been targeted. People who are struggling to get places because public transportation is a mess because drivers are out on reserve duty. This is affecting our lives in a very real, visceral, and constant way. And so I don't know that we have the luxury to sort of separate ourselves from it. Certainly when we're in Israel, when we're elsewhere, I think perhaps the calculus may be different. But I think that there's something very human and quite frankly, very Jewish to want to be engaged in this and to want to consume this information. And I've very much appreciated the outreach that I've received from friends, Jewish and non-Jewish, around the world who have reached out and expressed their concern, expressed their love, expressed their solidarity. And I have to say that the opposite has also been true. I've been confused by those of my Jewish friends who have not reached out, who have not posted about it, who don't seem overly concerned. I think that there's actually something somewhat deficient in people's Jewishness when they don't feel exercised by something so cataclysmic that affected so many fellow Jews here in Israel and in so many different ways. So that's how I've been sort of navigating the events of the past week.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I want to mine that a little bit, Avi. One of the things you said is, people's silence is noticeable. So if you were to write an article, here's what your Jewish friends need to hear from you right now, or here's what your Israeli friends need to hear from you right now. Could you fill in that blank for us? Just to help people know how to respond. Some people just simply don't know what to say and they say nothing. And that nothingness is very painful. I've heard from students on other campuses who've been really distressed and I would say feel real psychological isolation because their worlds are falling apart and no one's even noticed.
I had an exchange with a friend over several days last week. This friend was struggling to figure out what to say and how to phrase it and what words to use. And there were several drafts with several different paragraphs. And I said, just write one line. Say, friends in Israel, I love you, I care, I stand with you. That's all we need to hear. We don't need to hear anything more than that. We're horrified to see what happened. We can't believe that this is your reality. We, our solidarity with you is unwavering. Things like that, short sentences, that's all we need to hear. We don't need to hear, exposés about how, this is such an outrage to humanity and why we condemn this and why Hamas is this and why this doesn't represent Palestinians. And those things are important for another time. Right now, in the immediate aftermath of this, all Israelis and quite frankly, all Jews need to hear is, we love you, we care about you, we stand with you. That's the most important thing, I think, right now.
Yeah. I want to, I really appreciate the simplicity and the beauty of that kind of messaging. But now if we're going to sort of make it a little bit more sophisticated or maybe put the stakes up a little bit, we have a lot of universities where presidents have barely said a word. Or the statement they issued has sort of, again, morally relative or moral equivalence in a situation where we don't feel that moral equivalence applies. I'm so proud to be a member of the administration and faculty at Yeshiva University right now. Our students can be authentically committed and care and support Israel, as does our full administration, without the sense that they're alone. If you could speak to university presidents and give them a message, what would it be, Avi?
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of exchanges about exactly this question. It's not only, by the way, about universities, it's about corporations, it's about unions, about local governments in various different places who seem very eager to respond to other events that take place around the world. All sorts of outrages, including terrorist outrages, and to say so openly and to label them as terrorism. But when it comes to Israel, they seem to be more reticent, or they don't seem to know exactly what to say. I would say, if you spoke out against the Bataclan attack in France, or the mosque attack in New Zealand, or Sandy Hook, or Columbine, or the Pulse nightclub, or whatever other outrage you might have spoken out about in recent years, this is your opportunity to do the same thing for your Jewish students and to tell them that they are not alone, that you share their revulsion, you share their horror, you stand with them. There are resources available to them, and the administration wants to support them at this time. And it's confusing to me that there's so many organizations, so many universities that find it difficult to make that very, very plain and basic human statement, not even about a conflict so far away, but in the way that it affects students on campus for whom Israel is a part of their identity. This isn't to them some kind of geopolitical conflict that's 6,000 miles away. This is a part of what makes them Jewish. And the fact that so many university administrators find that difficult to comprehend and find it difficult to express that, I think is very troubling indeed.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's go back to the coverage question. How do you fact check during a war? How do you choose the stories that you want to put out on a particular day? Because in so many ways, you're setting the tone for the country, right? People are looking to you for guidance on how to think and frame these issues. So how do you fact check? How do you choose the pieces that you're going to pick?
So it's a question that we grapple with every single day, but it's obviously compounded during periods of conflict when there's so much information coming from so many different sources all at once. We have a sense of which sources are more reputable than others. We do lend certain credence to official Israeli sources. We view them as generally reliable. We view Hamas sources as generally unreliable. And so, for example, when there are casualty figures coming out of Gaza, we will be very careful to state that this is according to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, because people need to understand that Hamas is the sovereign in Gaza. It is a terrorist organization that just carried out this massive massacre, and also it's the one putting out these casualty figures. So who's to say whether they're accurate or not? And it's important that our readers know that. So we have those sources. When it comes to events taking place in Israel, we are obviously plugged into all the official WhatsApp channels, so we get a lot of information from Hatzalah, Magen David Adom, the hospitals, police, the fire brigade, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of information we'll share more readily. And certainly information that comes in the form of statements from various officials, world leaders, and so on and so forth. We feel that we can report those more accurately, but we are also often getting information from our counterparts and other news organizations. We follow those very, very carefully. And again, we have a sense of which ones are more reliable than others, and we'll be more eager to pass those on to our audience, obviously with attribution, than we would different news sources that we may view as somewhat less reliable. If we see something tweeted out, and this happens to me all the time, or I get a text message from someone, I might share that with our group, and we have a very active WhatsApp group that's used for updates to the website, and say, I just got this, let's look into it. So if it's something that took place, for example, there was a suggestion last week that there was a terrorist in Tel Aviv. Okay, so let's reach out to the Tel Aviv police or the Tel Aviv municipality and see if there's any truth to it. There wasn't. So, we have a way of verifying information, and it's the fairly constant thing, really around the clock, 24/7, 364 days a year, with the exception of Yom Kippur.
Yeah. So you mentioned sovereign, Avi. There are people who say this isn't a war. It can't be a war because Gaza is not a sovereign country. Are you sort of, do you agree with that sort of terminology or that technical aspect of it? Would you not call it a war?
I think it's a matter of semantics, really. The prime minister did declare a war. He declared it on Saturday of last week, and that was then confirmed by the cabinet and the Knesset. So this is officially in Israeli officialdom, it is a war. Whether or not Hamas is legitimate in the fact that it's a terrorist organization and also the entity that governs Gaza is obviously a conversation we can have. I can tell you that the IDF and the government view Hamas as responsible for what happens in Gaza, because whether we like it or not, they are the governing entity there. And so whether that lends them the label of sovereign, I think, is again open to discussion, but that's the context in which I used it. So it's obviously not a war between two equal sides. I think that goes without saying. On the one hand, you have a liberal democracy that is governed by the rule of law, that upholds the value of life, that tries to spare civilians. And on the other hand, you have a genocidal, fanatical, Islamist terrorist organization that wants nothing more than to murder civilians and to draw Israeli fire onto their own civilians and maximize casualties on both sides. So obviously, this is not a war of two entities on equal footing, but I think that there is a warlike element to it, and I think that will become much more evident in the days to come when Israel will likely engage in some kind of a ground offensive, and it will feel a lot more warlike perhaps than it does right now.
Yeah, you talked about maximizing civilian casualties on both sides. You know, there are Palestinians who are used as pawns by Hamas. There's stories there from a human interest standpoint, from a, you know, just in terms of their own plight. Do you cover those stories, or do you feel like they get their own coverage? How do you account for the balance in coverage?
So we don't have a correspondent in Gaza. I don't think it would be safe for a Jerusalem Post reporter to be in Gaza. We do often use content from Reuters and from other news agencies that do have a presence in Gaza. But when we do, we make sure that we comb through these articles before we put them online or put them in our paper to make sure that there's nothing there that we view as objectionable. So for example, if they refer to Hamas terrorists as militants, we will change it to terrorists. If they refer to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, we will change that language as well. So we're not going to take something just because it comes from what we consider to be a reputable source and publish it immediately. We feel that it doesn't align with our values, with the language we use, with our style guide, and so on and so forth. We do, to some extent, rely on voices coming from within the Gaza Strip. There are some serious journalists who do tweet out information, and we will use that as the basis for an article while at the same time verifying it and making sure that there's some truth behind it. But again, as I said, when it comes to official figures coming out of the Gaza Strip, we understand that those are coming from Hamas. They have every interest to inflate casualty figures, to engage in psychological warfare, to portray Israel in the worst possible way. And so we do our best to not play along with that. And so if there are figures that come from there, we say very clearly that it comes from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the psychological warfare. Could you describe it for us? Is that fair? I mean, just trying to understand is this is so draining emotionally, and we're so drawn to it. What do you think is at play here that might not have been the case without social media?
I think that when Hamas puts out statements like, you better not attack us because you might kill some of your own hostages, or we will execute a hostage for every Israeli airstrike that takes place, both of which happened. That is directly aimed at the Israeli public and is meant to apply pressure on the Israeli government to not attack, to not respond, to be more judicious in what it decides to do. We try not to play along with that. We obviously do feel that it's our duty to report what's coming out of the Gaza Strip in some way, and so we may utilize those statements while, of course, noting that they're coming from Hamas spokespeople and are part of a much broader context. But it's very, very clear that this is part of a psychological warfare campaign. Hamas is an old hand at this. We saw it with Gilad Shalit, where they would every so often send out a video of Gilad Shalit or a photograph of him with a paper designating that day, just to increase the pressure and to maximize the number of terrorists they could get in return for Shalit. And we can say that it actually worked. Like, they got over 1,500 terrorists in exchange for Shalit. And so they're quite effective at what they do. The question that I think faces the prime minister, and this is not a question that I would ever want to face myself, is if this is a reality, right? And we know that there are hostages being held in Gaza, and there is a likelihood that you will end up hitting some of them if you hit Hamas targets, because they're likely being used as human shields or being held in certain places. Does that prevent you from doing what you feel you have to do to take down Hamas, to impair its infrastructure and its ability to carry out more massacres? That's not a dilemma I would ever want to face, but it's one that is heightened by the psychological warfare that Hamas engages in very, very effectively and very directly, often, by the way, in Hebrew, to the Israeli public.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that description. It sort of puts us in the middle of it. So many diaspora Jews are asking themselves, Avi, what can we do at this moment? What would be helpful? I saw a column in the Jerusalem Post about someone who was collecting money for protective gear, but it was substandard gear. And so we're sort of, have a concern. Everyone wants to give, but perhaps donations will be, misused. Can you speak to that, what we can do and maybe what we should avoid doing because there are replications or it's not necessary? Give us some guidance, please.
So I think, as I said, the most important thing that Israelis need to hear right now is solidarity, and they need to hear it directly from American Jews, Jews around the world. Reach out to your loved ones, your friends, acquaintances, people you might know in Israel, and just say, "I'm here for you. I stand with you. I just want you to know that." That is the most basic human thing that I think many Israelis need to feel right now, and I have to say is very much appreciated. I would say, coupled with that is making that solidarity known, and quite frankly, making known that you stand with Israel publicly in wherever it is that you live. Attend a rally, write a letter to your member of Congress, write a letter to the editor of your local paper, or speak up on a call-in show, whatever it might be. This is a moment in which the narrative is already starting to shift. And we need to make people understand there's a context to what's happening in Gaza right now. It was just 1 week ago that 1,300 Israelis, including elderly men and women and infants and entire families, were slaughtered in the course of a single day. And this is something that people just need to keep hearing. They need to understand that that's the context of what's happening on the ground. So the extent that you feel comfortable engaging publicly on this and sharing those views and sharing that perspective with whatever audience you feel is at your disposal, it can be on social media, that I think is valuable as well. In terms of where you can contribute, where your money would be most valuable, there are certain established organizations out there that are known, that do incredibly powerful work. I mentioned Magen David Adom and Hatzalah. Those are two organizations that are extremely involved every single day in literally saving lives throughout Israel, and will likely continue to do so in the days and weeks ahead. All the hospitals in Israel, Friends of the IDF, there are numerous organizations that have to submit documentation to the IRS. They have reputable documentation to make sure that your money is going where it should and it's being spent in the right way. Those are the same organizations I think that I would recommend donating to now. And there may be others that will arise. We have actually reported on some of them. I think we view ourselves as a somewhat reputable source. So if we talk to you about an organization or a cause that we feel deserves your support, I think that's probably something that you consider to be somewhat reliable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If there are any questions from viewers and listeners, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat. We'll try to filter those questions out. World opinion seems to be with us, but can quickly turn against us. And as you pointed out a few times in this call, the narrative is already shifting. What do you think is going to be central to maintaining strong world support for Israel right now?
I in the immediate aftermath of this, we started seeing all these buildings around the world illuminated in blue and white, right? So we had the Empire State Building and 10 Downing Street in London and the White House and all these other places. And they were showing their solidarity. It was so lovely. But anyone who's been through this before, and we've all been through this before, know that at some point, once the casualties start mounting in Gaza, that's going to change real fast. And we already see that happening. As I said earlier, that was just one example. My conversation with MSNBC, I've been seeing this constantly throughout the past couple of days. The narrative is already shifting to, but what is Israel doing in Gaza? And is it really justified? And what about the plight of the people there? And by the way, the plight of people there deserves consideration, right? We don't want to be callous and say that people there need to suffer for the actions of Hamas. But the context does matter. And I think the importance of talking about that context and reminding people what happened just 1 week ago. And this is not a one-off. This is an organization that states in its charter that wants to murder every Jew around the world. And that's about doing that every single day. That's something that people need to hear. People need to hear that Iran is behind this. The Wall Street Journal reported that Iran was not only behind the planning, but actually gave the green light for this operation just a few weeks ago. So we need to remind people of that. This is not coming out of nowhere. Hamas is not, this lone wolf organization that just happens to be in Gaza, but it's part of this global movement that's set out to destroy the state of Israel and murder Jews. So I think to the extent that we can keep that in people's consciousness, keep talking about what happened last week and how it's part of a greater context, I think that will be helpful in shoring up public support for what Israel will have to do in the days and weeks ahead. I don't think it'll be easy. I think that we've seen this before. And as I mentioned earlier, the other side doesn't hesitate to show awful, awful photos of the aftermath of airstrikes and what happens when civilians are caught in the middle. And those speak, 1,000 or 1,000,000 words when they are portrayed in that way and when they're broadcast on social media and on international television networks. But we need to do whatever we can to push back and say, but there's a context here, and this is why Israel is doing what it has to do in order to eliminate the threat posed by Hamas.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier, we had spoken about the protest movement and how that's really obviously shifted. This is a shat hadchak. This is an emergency moment, and everyone, gets together. Do you think that we'll go back to that state, when this is over? Do you see, the understandable anger that this massive incursion happened and took us, and we were blindsided by it? What do you think the repercussions of that are going to be on Israeli leadership?
I think that this is a game changer. I frankly don't see how Netanyahu survives this. I think we had a poll the other day, I think it was on Friday, that 90%, over 90% of Israelis view the government as responsible for this cataclysmic military and intelligence failure. There will have to be a commission of inquiry, just as there was in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War and other military failures, and we'll have to see what happens at that point. I don't know that it'll be immediate. There are obviously those who are already calling on the prime minister to step down. They're fairly few and far between, but I think that there will have to be a reckoning afterwards. And I don't think that the political map will look anything like the way it did before the war, when the dust settles. And I don't think that we're likely to see the domestic agenda, including the judicial reform, advanced in exactly the same way afterwards. I think people's priorities are just going to be completely different.
Yeah, I just yesterday finished Deborah Lipstadt's excellent book on Golda, and reading about the repercussions of how a leader
Yep.
reckons personally. She said, after the war, I'll never be the same again, and how could you? So I'm interested in the long view of history, and I know you're reporting every day, sometimes every minute. When you think, how are we going to look at this moment? Maybe it's an inflection point in year 75. How are we going to look at this moment, do you think, in our history books in the future?
I think that remains to be seen. I hope that this is viewed as, on the one hand, a traumatic moment unlike any other in Israeli history, but one from which Israel emerged stronger and was able to rally and push back. I'm fairly confident that will happen. I can't guarantee that will happen. The devastation really is very, very profound, and especially if Hezbollah becomes involved in the north and Iran follows through on its threats to become involved in various ways, this could devolve in a very, very dangerous way. But I think that this will change a lot about how Israel views Gaza, how Israel views its own security. I don't know, for example, whether people will be eager to go back to those communities in the Gaza area. I've heard that some are already collecting funds to rebuild, and others may not. There's certain kibbutzim that may never be repopulated. It's certainly possible. A horrifying and really sad thought, but it's certainly possible. And so I think this will go down in the history books, similar to the Yom Kippur War, as an inflection point, something that changed Israeli society in many different ways. I imagine we'll, for many, many years, hear about acts of heroism and bravery under fire. We'll hear the stories of the victims. Hopefully the hostages will be freed, and we'll hear those harrowing accounts as well. But it's very clear to everyone this is a game changer, and Israel and Israeli society will be different after this than it was beforehand.
Yeah, it's also presidential. We're coming up to a presidential election year, and there's a lot of anxiety here on how will America continue support? Will the current administration continue support? There's appreciation for the very strong statements that have come out of the president, come out of Mayor of New York, the governor of New York. We're paying attention to political support. Any message there, if you could speak to American politicians about what Israel needs to hear right now?
I think Israelis are very appreciative of what world leaders in general, but American leaders in particular, have been saying. I can tell you that many of my friends circulated the president's address on their own social media platforms and said, if only we had leadership like that here. I think when Secretary Blinken came to Israel and talked about how this affects him not only as an American and a Secretary of State, but as a Jew, that was also something that had a tremendous impact on Israelis. Israelis just want to feel loved. They prefer it in obviously times of positivity and happiness and joy, but they appreciate it very deeply when it comes to times of crisis. And I think America's demonstration of its support, not only in the form of these statements, but in moving one carrier group, and we hear there might be a second one on its way to the Eastern Mediterranean to serve as a deterrent to Iran and other actors that might want to become involved, is also very much appreciated. The fact that the Secretary of Defense said that Israel will receive whatever it needs to defend itself in the form of munitions and arms and other supplies, I think, is also very much appreciated. So just more of that, I think, is something that Israelis just really need to hear right now.
So I just want to I want to bring our call to an end. I want to thank Avi. I want to tell you I'm getting all choked up, but thank you for your coverage and for your strength. And Rabbi Sacks makes a beautiful distinction between koach and gvura. The koach is the courage to fight, and gvura is the courage to restrain and to seek the peace. And we hope that we have koach and gvura in the weeks ahead. Thank you so much, Avi Meir.
Thank you.
And thank you to all our listeners. Tomorrow, Yeshiva University will be putting an online interview between Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman and Dr. Matt Levitt from the Washington Institute on counterterrorism and intelligence. Please join us 7 to 8 as our ongoing coverage and discussion of the current situation in the Middle East. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.